So we've been continuing to have regular NVC meetings, right, speech meetings for the group of us that have signed up for those. And I think there's about 9 of us in the monastery doing that. NVC referring to nonviolent communication or compassionate communication. And yesterday, as we were talking about, we were exploring a little bit of just the difficulty of using speech in a way to really be straightforward with the person in terms of examining, what's actually going on in the communication that might be something that isn't wholesome or helpful or that isn't clear, and how difficult that can be to point out to somebody in a way that does not encourage a defensive response. And often that really requires a very careful way of speaking that the other person really has a sense that when they're being given feedback or spoken to or trying to be more understood, that the person who's trying to do that is really coming from a sense of interest and care for the other person rather than a sense of suggesting that there's something wrong with them. So in the monastery, this is a given that part of the path that the Buddha points out is a path of mutual feedback, and being able to point out when we see that someone might be doing something in an unwholesome way or speaking in an unwholesome way. And I was reflecting upon the sense that for I would guess most human beings, this is not an easy thing to receive when somebody is pointing something out to us. And so much of that, I think, is because we have so much self around being correct or a person who doesn't make mistakes. All the more so we can see how attached we are if something like this is pointed out in public. And so it's interesting because when we try to change our attitude around it and we really explore what it is that somebody is suggesting to us or trying to understand around how we're speaking or what it is that we're doing that might be not so beneficial for ourselves, we open ourselves to a world of so much potential and possibility with insight. And so that's the conundrum, is there's a sense of, even if it's delivered well, it can be so difficult to receive feedback, and yet it's so beneficial. And so that sense that often occurs with this is that there's a resistance to a sense of being wrong. And so when we do open ourselves up to this, we start to see that there are blind spots in our perceptions of ourselves. We see that there are patterns that we enact over and over again that we don't see. This can be just our particular speech around, for example, making assumptions. Or I know for myself a tendency for being curmudgeon-y or sort of whining, whinging, complaining. And how helpful it is for someone when they point that out. It is indeed quite painful, but it really sheds the light on something that is, oh wow, I just don't see it that much because it's so much of the habit patterns that I continue to exhibit over and over again. And so that's why it's very important to see that when we live in a community like this, we're living with a bunch of mirrors, potentials for people to show us things that we're not seeing. And just in terms of that sense of mirrors, I'm just reminded of a story of a man who was taking colloidal silver. Probably many of you have heard about this. And over time, if you take colloidal silver, he was trying to use it as some sort of remedy, sort of folk medicine remedy. And he was living in a house for several months, I think taking care of parents. I can't remember what it was, but he wasn't getting out much. And he was using so much colloidal silver that after, I don't remember what it was, 3 to 6 months, some people started to remark to him, oh, your complexion seems to have changed. And indeed, he hadn't seen over time that he had basically turned into a Smurf. He was literally like the color blue. And that's kind of, I think, how our patterns, the sort of thoughts and the mechanisms in our life, of our behavior, just overtake us. And we don't see it. We're not able to see it clearly. incrementally sometimes moving towards the unwholesome. And without a mirror, without another person to really encourage us to look at ourselves and to say, oh, I keep seeing this coming up for you. And even sometimes when it's done in a way that we might not appreciate, we might think, oh, I wish that was said differently. As Lumpur Cha said, it's helpful, if somebody calls you a dog, just to turn around and see if you have a tail. If you don't, then there's no problem. But we need to be very careful of taking these things so personally and thinking about how we hold ourselves as someone who's not wrong, who doesn't have problems or anything that is potential to be pointed out for others. And when we do that, then we really open the door to the possibilities of so much potential for change. And so whenever this occurs, that we can really have someone point something out, as the Buddha talks to us about this, he says that this is a treasure, this is a gem, and we should hold what is said to us as a precious gem, because it's not always so common for people to point things out, because it takes a certain amount of courage and energy for that person to be willing to talk to us in the first place. So this is just an encouragement when we do hear some feedback from someone, just to try to take it in patiently and with gratitude for the other person being willing to say something. And also with that sense of what can be gained out of this that can be so beneficial, and also to look internally at that, what's really going on when we struggle against that and we fight against that, and we say things like, well, what does he know? And he should look at his own behavior. And so when we try to drop that, then we really do have this potential for so much insight and the removal of more dust from our eyes. Well,